Hello, and welcome to the Griddy Films nitty-gritty review of Justice League. This is, of course, the 2017 superhero movie just released in theaters. It's written by Chris Terrio and Joss Whedon, and is directed by Zack Snyder, and it's starring Ben Affleck, Gal Gadot, and Henry Cavill. It's rated PG-13 for some sequences of sci-fi action and violence. This movie is kind of like if the movies Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron had a baby, and that baby one day grew up to realize, oh my god, I'm exactly like my parents. But if that sounds harsh, don't worry. I have plenty of good things to say about this movie. So the first category on my grid is going to be genre. And when it comes to genre, Justice League pretty much hits all of the standard tropes and archetypes. The genre is still relatively new, so it can kind of get away with it. But that said, we are starting to get movies like Deadpool and even Thor Ragnarok that are very self-aware and know the tropes and kind of start to make fun of them. So hopefully DC movies in the future are going to start to shy away from the very formulaic genre tropes and archetypes that they've been sticking with. But we definitely get those with Justice League. You know, you have the unnecessary and forced sexual tension between Bruce Wayne and Diana. You have a female superhero surrounded by male superheroes. She's got to hook up with somebody. But the Bruce Wayne, Diana Prince, just felt like an unnecessary trope that was thrown in for the sake of being there. There was also some archetypical aspects to Lois Lane's character. You know, she just has a myriad of personality traits that were just completely washed out just to make her be this codependent extension of Superman instead of her own character. She had no agency. She just had no purpose aside from reminding him of his humanity and making him look good in the press. Those two things are her only functions within the DC Extended Universe. And I get that those are functions that Lois Lane has, and she should have those functions. It would have been nice to see her serve more functions than that. Overall, I gave the genre category a 4.67 out of 10, which is going to be a C-. I consider a 5 out of 10 to be average. It just definitely, fell into all the standard tropes and didn't really take any risks or challenge any of the tropes. And I think because the genre has developed to the point where we can start being self-aware about these tropes, DC is going to have to start not necessarily making, the more meta self-aware type movies, but just being aware of the tropes and fitting that into their scripts so that it's not quite so predictable and so formulaic. The next category in my grid is going to be writing. In general, the plot structure of Justice League was very simple, considering not just how many characters they have, but how many new characters they're introducing to the franchise. I think they were actually able to use a very simple plot and then introduce all those characters in a really efficient way, and it wasn't riddled with holes. There are a few basic little questions I have, but no gaping holes. I'm not quite sure if this would be considered a plot hole or just people being stupid, but after Superman is resurrected, the Mother Box goes flying, and not one of the 5 heroes thinks to maybe go retrieve that box. And then not only that, but when Steppenwolf comes to get the box, which everybody knew he would do, they just stand from afar and watch. And just on a quick note with the writing, did it bother anybody else that none of these heroes even tried to maintain their secret identities? It really bothered me that they just willy-nilly use their real names left and right. At least try to be a little more covert, guys. Come on. I also want to mention real quick some of the similarities between Justice League and both Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron. I think the most obvious to me was the scene where Steppenwolf first comes out of the Mother Box on Themyscira. That scene was almost identical to the scene where Loki comes out of the Tesseract. There was also the scene where they're all discussing whether or not they should resurrect Superman, which felt very similar to scenes in Age of Ultron when Tony Stark and Bruce Banner are discussing whether or not they should build Ultron. And then the last scene that I thought was really similar, Wonder Woman's sharpening her knife and they're all kind of going back and forth. And that scene just felt very much, not just in tone, but even the composition of the shots just felt extremely similar to the scene in Avengers where you have Loki's spear in the background and it's kind of influencing them. You also have other smaller similarities. The insect army very similarly resembled Ultron's army. There were also a few shots in the final fight scene that looked really similar to a few shots from the final fight scene in Avengers. And then the last similarity I thought is the origin story of Cyborg was incredibly similar to the origin story of Vision. Some of the stronger points in the writing are going to come with the character development and as well as the general humor of the movie. I think for the first time in the DC extended universe, we have characters who have clear internal struggles as well as external goals. So all 6 of our main heroes are working together to stop Steppenwolf. So all of their outer goal is going to be the same. But within that, they each have their own internal struggle. Diana's learning how to accept a role as a leader, even if it risks people's lives. Cyborg is learning to accept his new abilities and accept who he is. Aquaman's trying to figure out which world he belongs to, Atlantis or Man's Land. Flash, who doesn't know how to get along with humans and he needs friends. You have Superman, who needs to be reminded of his humanity. The one character who doesn't really have much of an internal storyline is going to be Bruce Wayne. But yeah, I think to have 6 main characters and have 5 of those 6 have a presence internal storyline in addition to the external storyline, I think that's the mark of a pretty strong script. So even though there are some weaknesses, that strength definitely takes it a long way. I think one of my favorite character moments in the movie, we've got the everybody fights Superman for some reason scene. Diana and Bruce Wayne are both trying to remind Superman of who he is. And Diana takes the approach of, you are Kal-El, you're the last son of Krypton, whereas Bruce Wayne takes the approach of, you're Clark Kent. So I thought that was really interesting and a really important distinction between not just the way they see Superman, but the way they see humanity and identity. I think my favorite story arc within the movie was Diana's arc of learning how to, accept her role as a leader. And I think that arc ended really well when you have the mirror images at the start and end of the film. The movie starts with Superman talking to the kids about what it's like to be a hero. And I think when we see her at the end talking to a group of school kids, and it very much so mirrors what we see at the beginning, and just kind of shows in a very simple way, that she's willing to take on this role as a leader and to be a beacon, even if it means potentially letting people down or potentially leading people into battle and to their death. Like she's willing to accept those risks by the end of the movie when she wasn't at the beginning. And it's more of an arc, I think, even than you got in Wonder Woman. So it was nice to see her kind of grow. I also really liked the scene where Aquaman is going around telling everybody why they're all going to fail. And then when he gets to Wonder Woman, all he can think to say is that she's gorgeous because she has no weaknesses. But then I also liked her reaction to it. She gets him to reveal his weaknesses and she tells him that that's beautiful. He was telling his truth for probably the first time in his life. I think to her, truth is beauty. And the last thing about the writing, I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, but I really liked that there was humor and levity throughout the script. Probably at least 90% of those moments of humor were Joss Whedon's contributions. I do hope the DC Extended Universe has kind of gotten out of its system this ongoing joke of Diana's so hot, men just get so flustered. We get it. She's hot. Can we move on? The introduction between Diana and Barry Allen was actually pretty charming and endearing. But then you've got Barry Allen falling on top of Diana and getting all awkward. And anytime there's an action movie with one female character surrounded by male characters, one of those male characters is gonna fall on top of her and get awkward. It didn't get to a point where it was obnoxious in Justice League, but if we keep seeing it in movies that she's in, it's gonna get old real fast. So for the writing category, I gave it a 7.2 out of 10, which I consider to be a solid B. It's definitely above average, but definitely isn't pushed into the A range, and certainly isn't perfect. The next category is gonna be the editing and special effects. This is gonna be by far one of the weaker categories. I think most of these topics have been well discussed in other places, so I'm not going to get too into my criticisms, but I will say that the CGI was just pretty lacking. There's definitely the Henry Cavill mustache fiasco issue going on. But even aside from that, the Steppenwolf CGI, I feel like that character would have been so much better served if they just had an actor in prosthetics. I mean, the CGI, it just felt either they were really rushed and tried to finish the CGI in time to meet the premiere date, or they just didn't have enough money to really make the CGI what it needed to be, and it could have been both. I'm not really sure what the combination was, but whatever it was, the CGI just wasn't really up to par. It's not enough to make the movie unwatchable, but it's definitely noticeable. The fight scenes could have been a little bit more badass. They just felt very chaotic, which I think very well could have been intentional, but I would have liked to see, have each hero have a moment or two of just badassness. It just seemed like it was missing a little something. It still looked very good. The action's not bad. Definitely, I didn't leave the theater nearly as pumped up as I did after Wonder Woman. Overall, the editing and special effects got a 4.8 out of 10, which is going to be a solid C, so pretty much average. I mean, really, the editing in general kind of kept it at the average point, despite the CGI being well below average. So I think a 4.8 out of 10 is pretty fair. If anything, that might even be a little bit too generous, because the CGI really definitely lacking. The next category is going to be the sound. And when I talk about sound, I'm going to be talking about the score and soundtrack, as well as the sound effects and the overall sound mix. With this movie, there wasn't really anything that stood out when it comes to the sound effects or the sound mix, but the score is definitely something to talk about. I'm not typically the biggest fan of Danny Elfman, but I did really like the use of the 1989 Batman theme, along with the 70s Superman theme, and then with the 2017 Wonder Woman theme, having each of those three characters have their own themes. It wasn't just fun and a nice throwback, but it also helped to give each character their own unique feel and vibe. So the score definitely well above average. My only complaint with the score and soundtrack was the song Everybody Knows at the beginning, and the lyrics certainly fit the tone of the movie. The whole montage that went along with that song was just kind of unnecessary and just didn't really fit. So there's partly the editing and partly the song choice. That did knock the score and soundtrack category down a little bit. And then I didn't really find anything worth noting within the sound effects or the sound mix. So for the sound category overall, I gave it a 6.67, which is a B-. The score definitely knocks the category above average, but everything else was pretty average within the category. The next category is going to be the acting and the casting. This movie had very strong acting, and the casting choices were very good. Even Ezra Miller, who seemed like a really odd choice for the Flash. Just physically, he really doesn't look anything like the Flash, but I think he had a good energy and he seemed to fit well with everybody, and I'm definitely glad that Aquaman's bad reputation seems to be coming to an end thanks to his portrayal by Jason Momoa. One thing that I definitely missed in the movie was some of the great facial expressions we got from Gal Gadot in Wonder Woman, particularly during fight scenes. We really didn't have a lot of that in this movie, but we did get to see Wonder Woman kind of laughing and smiling and having fun more in this movie. We really haven't seen that from her character before, and that's even true of, pretty much everybody. You know, we see Superman laughing and joking around, we see Batman making jokes, and we get to see just some different sides to these characters. I'm still really not fond of the casting choice of Lois Lane. I love Amy Adams. I think she's a really talented actor. She just doesn't fit the part for Lois Lane. A big part of that's probably in the writing. They also didn't really try very hard to make her look like Lois Lane, at least make her brunette. I just don't understand the logic there. But then even just her portrayal, she just really doesn't fit. Another thing that bothered me a little bit within this category was Superman's, I'm angry voice that doesn't sound anything like that, but does sound a lot like Batman. I think he only did it in Justice League during the scene when everybody's fighting Superman. and he's basically Red Kryptonite Superman. So for the acting category, I gave it a 7.7 out of 10, which is going to be a B+. Almost pushed into that A range. Very solid acting. Definitely good casting choices, aside from Amy Adams. But, you know, so yeah, 7.7, B+, above average, almost an A. The next category is going to be directing and cinematography. There wasn't a ton that stood out in either the directing or the cinematography that was really, really good, and nothing really stood out as really bad. There were definitely some similarities, to Avengers and Age of Ultron, which is partly in the writing and partly in the mise-en-scène of just some of the shots themselves. Zack Snyder also has a penchant for symbolism, and I do think it gets in the way of the storytelling at times. For example, when Wonder Woman is first introduced, we see her on top of the Lady Justice statue, very obviously a symbol of Wonder Woman herself being Lady Justice. But meanwhile, so she's climbed up to the top of this thing, or flew up, or however she got up to the top, is standing there, looking, listening. Meanwhile, like, 20 people were shot, like, 10 minutes ago, and she's still just up on this statue. And I know you can't save them all, but you could hurry it along a little. I'm just saying. But he does definitely like his symbolism, which can get some good visuals, but can also interfere with the storytelling. And I always prefer good storytelling over good visuals. Both is preferred if you can get both, but if you can only have one, go with story. And I think Zack Snyder has the opposite philosophy, which is fine if that's what you like, but it's not what I like, so I lost some points in my grade for that. So overall, for the directing and cinematography, I gave it a 6 out of 10, which is a B-. Little bit above average, but nothing really particularly exceptional. The next category is going to be what I call character aesthetics. Now, this is going to be hair, makeup, and costumes. Most of what I have to talk about is going to come in the costumes. And I'm going to try and keep it brief, but let's just talk for a minute about those Amazon costumes. I just don't understand the purpose. And to be fair, I don't think Zack Snyder is going out of his way to sexualize women. I think he's going out of his way to sexualize everybody. Like the fight scene when everyone's fighting Superman. Like, what happened to his shoes and socks and shirt? He did not need to be shirtless for that scene. We also have in the exposition scenes where we learn about Steppenwolf. There's randomly someone who looks like he came out of 300 fighting. Who would wear that in battle? So to be fair, it's not just the Amazons who received this treatment. It's pretty much everybody, but it still irritates me, just because it's not necessary, and I think Wonder Woman proved that a lot of people agree that it's not necessary. We don't need to overly sexualize everything. And again, he's not just doing it with women. It's not a matter of overly sexualizing women or objectifying women. I don't think that's the issue. He just seems to have an obsession with the human form, almost in the same way as like the ancient Greeks who, competed in the Olympics naked, because you gotta see everything, and I think that's basically what Zack Snyder is doing. He can't just have them naked, but he's gonna get them as close as possible. He just wants to exhibit perfect human specimens. I think that's what it comes down to, both male and female, and I don't think it's a sexist issue. I think it's just an issue. There's just no need for Amazons to be showing midriffs or for Superman to be fighting shirtless. It just makes no sense. Put on some clothes. Like, you're fighting. So that's my issue with the costumes. So for the character aesthetics category, I give it a 5.33 out of 10. It's going to be a C, pretty much average. I would have deducted a lot more points for some of his costume choices, but to be fair, the 6 main heroes, except for some bad CGI with the Superman uniform, the 6 main costumes are all pretty awesome and definitely deserve some credit. So 5.33 out of 10, solid C. Could have been better if he just wasn't so obsessed with the human form, I think is what it comes down to. The next category is going to be the environmental aesthetics, and this is going to be sets, props, and locations. This is another category that I really just don't have a ton to say about. Nothing stood out as bad, nothing really stood out as good. This is pretty average straight down the line. So for environmental aesthetics, I gave it a 6 out of 10, B minus. Slightly above average, but I mean really nothing stood out as spectacular. The next category is going to be the impact on film, and this one is really difficult for newer movies, and particularly for this movie because it's brand new as of this recording, but I think it's pretty fair to give an estimation of where this is going to lie. As far as critical impact, it's definitely not going over super well with critics, and I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon. So I only gave it 1 point out of 5 as far as the critical impact goes. I also gave Justice League a 1 out of 5 for inspirational impact, because I don't really see this movie as being inspiring to future filmmakers. I didn't give it 0 points because I think it is going to have some impact, but not a lot. So I just gave it 1 there. But then for cult impact, I gave it 3 out of 5 because I do think it's going to have a fan following. Not the strongest. I think even within fans, there's going to be a lot of people that think it's either just mediocre or they're going to find a lot of flaws within it, particularly things like the CGI is going to turn a lot of people off. So it's not going to get a particularly high score within that, but a 3 out of 5 I think is fair. So overall, I gave the impact on film, it's going to average out to a 3.33 out of 10, which is a D. The last category in my grade is going to be overall enjoyment. Now, I actually saw this movie in theaters twice, and the first time I didn't like it nearly as much as the second time. I think I accidentally went in looking for flaws because I had heard the reviews weren't great, and when you go in looking for flaws, you're probably going to find them. But then I went back to see it a second time, primarily because I wanted to take notes for this review, and I expected to find even more flaws and to dislike it even more. And instead the opposite happened. Some of the flaws didn't bother me nearly as much, and that there were a lot of things that I really liked that I didn't quite pick up on the first time. So the first time I saw Justice League, I gave it a 6 out of 10 for overall enjoyment. But after seeing it a second time, I actually bumped it up to an 8 out of 10, which I consider an A minus. So now we get to the extra credit portion of my grid, where I essentially give up to 5 points of extra credit for kind of silly reasons. And I actually gave Justice League the full 5 points of extra credit. The first point I gave for the awesome Green Lantern cameo. It was awesome to get to see a Green Lantern fighting, and it was really cool to see that when he fell in battle, you know, the ring flew off to go find the next Green Lantern. Yeah, that was cool and definitely worth a point of extra credit. The next point of extra credit goes to the Pet Sematary reference. It just seemed like a more obscure reference to pull out. The next point of extra credit I gave just for Batman's face when Superman shows up to fight the final battle. His face just reminded me of when the high school girl sees her boyfriend walk into prom when he swore he was too cool for school and would never go to prom, but then there he is. He just had that look on his face, and it's amazing. It makes me very, very happy. So, extra credit, easily, just for that reaction shot. The fourth point of extra credit I gave for the second post-credit scene. Growing up watching Super Friends, I was very familiar with the Legion of Doom and got very excited. Then I realized, of course, that this isn't Super Friends and they're going to be forming the Anti-Justice League. But yeah, there was just something about that post-credit sequence that really got me excited. Of course, then I remembered Suicide Squad and how bad that was and got a little nervous, but it still got me excited, even if hesitantly so. So I gave it a point of extra credit. The last point of extra credit is probably the silliest reason I'll ever give extra credit to a movie. As I was walking out of the theater, I was wearing a Wonder Woman t-shirt, had a hood on it, it's got like the tiara on the hood, so I was wearing that with the hood up, because it seemed like the thing to do. And as I'm walking out of the theater, a little girl sees me, sheepishly waves and says, "Hi, Wonder Woman." And it was just adorable, and it made my day. And she clearly didn't see the very professional-looking cosplayers dressed as Wonder Woman in the theater. So even though it's not really related to the movie itself, it's a memory that I will associate with the movie, and so I gave it an extra credit for that. So the total score for Justice League is going to be a 64.71, which I still consider to be a B-. It's above average, but if you're not a fan of the superhero genre or you don't care about the DC characters, you can probably just go ahead and skip it. But if you like superhero movies and just the DC characters, it's worth seeing. It's fun. It's not going to be the best movie you've ever seen. I think Wonder Woman is a little bit better, even though the writing is definitely stronger in Justice League. You know, like I said, if you like superhero movies, go ahead and see it. It's worth it. Don't let the low Rotten Tomatoes score fool you. So that's about it for my nitty-gritty review of Justice League. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to Griddy Films on YouTube. You can also follow Griddy Films on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And there is a Griddy Films Patreon account as well if you're interested in learning how you can support Griddy Films. All social media accounts are linked on the YouTube channel for Griddy Films, as well as on the Griddy Films website, which is going to be griddyfilms.com, and that's Griddy spelled Griddy films.com.